This happened back when I was 18 years old. I'm currently 33 years old. I grew up in a rural area of Kentucky, and I lived next to the Senator of Kentucky, who had bought our neighborhood when it was all just old farmland and woods. When I was 18, my yard had backed up to the Senator's house, and I worked her farmland and did chores around her land just to make some extra cash in the summer. The Senator had massive amounts of land still that backed up into unused public land that went for miles and miles, mainly tiny streams, fields and trees, nothing too exciting. It was next to a small highway, and we had to cross it to get to the next part of the woodlines. My friend, who we will call Auntie, also did the chores and land work, and he had a little brother as well, who we will call Willie, and he was about 15. We all grew up in an area that was pretty safe, so our parents let us do whatever we want, and just to be back at a decent time. We often explored these lands during the day to see how far we could go or even find anything in the woods that would be pretty cool to explore. Usually we found nothing, some makeshift campsites for what we assumed was hunting and just camping. One day we went pretty close to dusk, and we happened to bring flashlights just in case it got too dark. This was during the fall of 2008, and the leaves were falling, and it was coating the ground pretty thick with leaves. As we are walking, I started to notice we had been going in a circle, and I assumed we were lost, and we could no longer hear the highway that was close to us. The sun was going down pretty quick, and we only had maybe about an hour left of light. It eventually got dark, and we started walking around in the woods with our flashlights. It quickly got darker and darker, and it was around 10 p.m. at this time, and we were still lost. If you're wondering why we didn't call with our cell phones, I grew up relatively modest life, and my parents only gave me a flip phone, and service back then was extremely bad, especially deep in the woods. Throughout the night, we were trying our best to find the way we came, but it was near impossible in the dark, thick woods. My dad always told me whenever you're in the woods and it suddenly becomes extremely quiet at any point, that means that there's a much larger predator in the area. Auntie, Willie and I were walking, and suddenly everything in the area got extremely quiet, except for one noise, and that was a whistling. We all stopped dead in our tracks and began to look around in every direction in an attempt to verify where it was coming from. Stupidly enough, Auntie whistled back, and we all know you are not supposed to whistle back in the woods, especially at night. I hit Auntie with my hand and told him, "Why would you do that?" And the whistling started to grow louder and louder, so I told everyone to start running. As we were running, the whistling got softer and softer, and eventually it went away. If we weren't lost before, we were now. It was around midnight now, and the full moon and its light was lighting up the area somewhat well. As we were wandering around, we happened to walk up into an old rundown shack. It looked like it still had somewhat of a door on it, and through the door, we could see a small fire going, as any dumb white person would do. We opened the door and asked if anyone was around. At that moment, we heard leaves crunching, and we all turned around, but nothing was there. What happened next felt like a scene straight out of a horror movie. Out of nowhere, the whistling started again, and it sounded like it was right next to us, and we all turned towards the sound. And there she was, a whistling woman in torn-up clothing and a really crappy appearance. She was about 5 feet from us. We slightly shifted back a bit, and we just looked at her with the flashlights pointing at her. We said hello. As if something we had just said something wrong, she just completely lost her mind and began screaming extremely loud. She lunged at Auntie, and out of self-defense, Auntie swung his flashlight directly into the lady's face, and she fell to the ground. We started running because we were terrified, and she began to take chase after us while still screaming. I assume this lady had to be on drugs because she was extremely fast, and pain did nothing to her. We kept running through the woods for at least 15 minutes, and she was still chasing us. We eventually lose her and decided to take a break behind some bushes because of how tired we were. To our horror, we started hearing the whistling again. We sat there for at least an hour before we worked up the courage to keep running. We started running and we could hear footsteps chasing us. At this point, she stopped whistling, but was still running after us without making any noise. We could hear her footsteps right behind us. All of a sudden, we started to hear the highway again. We kept on running in the direction of the highway noise and finally made it back to the main road. Assuming she was still chasing us, we got as close as we could to the highway and flagged someone down. A random guy stopped and let us all in. He instantly noticed our extremely pale faces and asked what was wrong. We explained the whole situation, and he told us that there are a lot of homeless and mentally unstable people that live in those woods. He was kind enough to drop us home, and we decided to never visit those woods ever again. When I was around 5 years old, me and my older sister would go out to play in the woods really often. We used to live right beside the woods, so it wasn't far away for us at all. After school, we would always eat something and then go out to play in the woods. We would carve our names in trees, build little shelters with branches, play hide and seek, and so on. It was an ordinary day, just like any other. Me and my older sister decided to go in the woods to just take a walk and get some fresh air. The sun was just about to set, so we wanted to take a little walk before it got dark. We quickly got ready and left the house. We only made it a few steps before we both literally stopped in our tracks. To this day, I still remember how my legs just froze because of what we both saw. About 30 feet ahead of us, there was a man in a black cloak with the hood up, facing towards us. His face wasn't visible because he was looking down. The long sleeves of his cloak covered his arms, but it looked like he had his hands together as if he was praying, and he wasn't moving at all. I think he must have heard us because he looked up at us and we looked straight at him. But to our horror, we couldn't see any face. His face was fully blacked out because of the shadow of his hood. Me and my sister both looked at each other, and as much as we wanted to scream, we couldn't. She held my arm tightly and slowly started backing up, still looking at him. I couldn't even walk because of how scared I was, so she was basically just dragging me along with her. We slowly kept walking backwards until we got far enough to where he was barely visible, and that's when we both ran the remainder of the way to our house. When we got home, we decided to keep this a secret, and to never tell anybody what we saw that day. Still to this day, we both have no explanation for what we saw that day. Something about a man being alone in the middle of the woods, with a black cloak on staring at the ground, doesn't feel right. Maybe it's some sort of a weird cult member, who knows? I'm just glad we both managed to make it back home safely that day. This happened to me last summer, and it's probably the scariest thing I've ever experienced. It was a warm summer night in England, and my friend, who I'll call Chris, was sleeping over at my house. Chris and I have always been night owls, so whenever we sleep over at each other's houses, we usually stay up pretty late. We were up at around 2 in the morning, bored out of our minds trying to think of stuff to do. We are both into the outdoors, so I came up with the idea to go on a short night hike near my house. We brought some firecrackers to light off and some music. Looking back, it was a dumb idea, but whatever. I live on a rural dirt road surrounded by woods, so there's a decent amount of trails near me. We got there and noticed that it was very muddy, so it was difficult to walk. I accidentally dropped my flashlight and it broke. We were considering turning around at this point, but we ended up just using our phone flashlights. I have been to this place before, and I knew of a pond with a dock that was on the trail that we could go to. The hike to the dock only took about 20 minutes. When we got there, we were greeted by hundreds of frogs croaking constantly, which made us a little on edge, but we stayed. We lit off some of those little red firecrackers, and it made a lot of sound. We started to play some music on our speaker, and just when we were starting to have a good time, when Chris told me to turn the music down because he thought he heard something, I turned it down, and there was the sound of an engine in the not so far distance. It sounded like an ATV or another type of small vehicle. These trails are known to have ATVs and some other type of vehicles, so it's not out of the ordinary to hear those type of noises out there. But all I could think was, who the hell would be out riding out here at this time of night? It was probably around 2:30 in the morning when we heard this noise. Me and Chris looked at each other with a confused look. The sound was coming closer. We decided to quickly pack up our stuff. Whatever vehicle it was coming to our location, and we didn't know if it was someone dangerous or not, so we hid in the nearby bushes. The vehicle had reached us and had stopped just before the opening to the dock and was just idling for a solid 5 minutes there. This is the weird part. Whoever it was had their headlights turned off and most likely used a small flashlight to navigate, so we could not see their location. They were purposely trying not to be seen, which makes us believe that the person on that vehicle had bad intentions. Our hearts were pounding, and at this point, we were genuinely scared. After 5 minutes, the vehicle left the opening and headed off in another direction. Once we thought it was far enough, we booked it back to the car, just using my phone screen light to see. On the way back, we saw fresh exhaust smoke lingering and tyre tracks on the trail, which meant they saw our car at the trailhead and knew we were there. Thankfully, we made it back to the car, and while we were driving home, Chris expressed how dangerous of a situation that could have been. Maybe it was someone who was trying to help us, but that doesn't explain why he was trying to purposefully hide his location by turning off his headlights. Maybe we dodged a really dangerous situation. Who knows?